We're coming at it from the data pipeline perspective of your data gets created, it needs to be stored, it needs to be moved through memory and moved to the processors. Well, AI has changed how that needs to happen because the capability of the GPUs to consume data has just far outpaced the ability of local storage and local memory to have the data there and feed it into the GPUs.
The Digital Banking Podcast is powered by Typhon. Typhon is the creator of Infinia, a dramatically better digital banking platform for community financial institutions, as well as several platform-agnostic, revenue-generating point solutions. Our highly configurable platform and broad ecosystem of third-party partners ensure our entire suite is scalable and extensible to meet the needs of any FI. On our podcast, you will hear host Josh DeTar discuss today's most pressing financial technology topics with seasoned industry experts from every possible discipline.
You know, your podcast hasn't officially made it until there's ads in it. But this is one you're not going to want to skip past. And, well, if you do, feel free to hit that fast forward 15 seconds button twice. Ever wonder what gives me my energy and enthusiasm during these podcasts? You know, outside of my relentless desire to learn about, connect, share, and build up community FIs and their mission to support the communities they serve? It's coffee, and lots of it. Now, you want to know what's better than your regular old coffee? How about donating $5 to the Children's Miracle Network hospitals through Credit Unions for Kids every time you purchase high-quality, ethically sourced coffee that also provides living wages to coffee farmers? So if you want to listen to this episode with epic levels of caffeine-induced focus and help kids in need, head to javaforkids.org to learn more and buy a bag or 10. Thanks.
Welcome to another episode of the Digital Banking Podcast. My guest today is JB Baker, the VP of Products and Marketing at Scale Flux. You know, there seems to be a common trait of the types of people I'm drawn to having as guests on this podcast. Coincidentally, it's probably a similar trait you have if you're listening to this podcast. And the trait I'm referring to is that of a lifelong learner. JB has always been curious, but not just curious. Curiosity may only take you so far or so deep. JB says his natural tendency is to be a lifelong learner that wants to dive all the way in, even back to childhood. For example, he loved playing with model rockets, but not just buying one, launching it, seeing it come down, and then doing it again. He liked to tinker. Okay, if I change the angle of the fin, what happens? Okay, it goes up and proceeds to immediately turn and smash into the ground. Got it. That's not going to work. Okay, what about how can I help it go higher and then still come back safely? It was the process of learning, taking data points, and evolving based on the learnings that he really enjoyed. And that mentality has carried through life and allowed JB a unique opportunity to make massive changes in career paths throughout life. It would be pretty easy to say, I was in chip design at Intel, and then I went into chip optimization at Intel, right? How about I was in corporate travel negotiation at Intel, and then went into data storage product management at Intel? That's a pretty big jump. How does he do it? Well, he says he used to be a big reader. If JB wanted to learn about a new thing, he immersed himself in books. He grew up pre-internet, so, that tells you a little bit of something. But what I find cool is he said now, instead of reading, he just asks ChatGPT. And that should tell you something about where we're headed in this episode. I'm really intrigued to have JB on today because his field of expertise is really far outside of mine. So I'm leaning in with genuine curiosity today. JB, thanks so much for joining me and being a guest on the podcast today, man.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so I got to start with, it was pretty cool. You were just telling me, thankfully this podcast recording wasn't yesterday, it's today, because you're coming back from being a little under the weather because you just got back from an event with quite a few other people. So you were at NVIDIA's GTC conference. How was that?
It was insane. I mean, it was just... I don't know what other way to describe it. It was a madhouse. Just so many people there, so many different technologies, different ways in which AI is impacting not just data centers, but they call it virtual factories and how do you design physical products. So just all over the place. And we were lucky enough to get a booth there, and the traffic was insane. I mean, there were four days of show floor, and usually by day 2 or 3, things have slowed down, and it's kind of a trickle of, because everybody's kind of been around and seen the booths. But we were busy all the way through until the close on Friday, when they started playing. It's closing time. It's you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. They're like physically pushing people out of the door because people still wanted to stay.
Crazy. I mean, that is a wild story in and of itself, right? Is just kind of the state of NVIDIA today. And what I think is kind of interesting is I think it's actually a good almost representation of even the topic we're going to talk about today, for the exact reason of what it is, right? But NVIDIA has been around for a very, very long time. It's not like they were born yesterday, right? But I think a lot of times people think they kind of came out of nowhere, especially if you're not really in the technology world. And now all of a sudden you're seeing everything from, the crazy stuff that NVIDIA is turning out, and products that are hitting the market that are getting, mainstream media attention, to hearing about your, friends or people on the internet who made buku bucks by buying NVIDIA stock. They're all over the news. But like I said, they didn't just come out of nowhere, right? I mean, the company's been around for a very long time. And that's the same with AI, right? I think a lot of folks are like, oh my gosh, AI kind of came out of nowhere. But in all reality, it's been here for a very, very long time. And we've been working on it for a very long time. It's just the way that a lot of times technology kind of manifests its innovation happens on a really steep curve. And so we don't see the really long tail of the really slow growth. But then all of a sudden it doubles and it doubles and it doubles and it doubles, and doubling nothing to a little bit more than nothing, you don't really see. But all of a sudden, when it goes from 100 to 200 and 200 to 400 and 400 to 800 and 800 to 1600, right? Then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this thing came out of nowhere. So I'm just curious, when you were at GTC, what was the energy like in terms of just that? Hey, this thing has really blown up and is massive. What was that like?
I mean, I don't know how to describe it really. It is a massive amount of energy and excitement around all the different ways that AI can be utilized. I think over the last couple of years, there's been, most of the focus has been on the LLMs and the ChatGPTs and DeepSeek and all of these, because that kind of became that killer app that was easy to use and brought AI to the masses. Right. And it also consumed tons and tons of compute power and storage and networking, and drove innovation throughout the industry. I mean, you mentioned that long tail. I recently had the opportunity to do a keynote for a conference, and they asked me to come in and talk about efficiency in the industry. And one of the things that I found as I was prepping for it was how petaflops had grown for model training in AI over the years. And petaflops is just a measure of how many compute cycles are consumed. And it took 60 years to get to using 1 petaflop to train a model. Okay. So 60 years from kind of nothing to 1 petaflop. And then from that point, it took just 10 years to go from that 1 petaflop to over 10 billion petaflops. So
that's crazy.
This last decade, it's certainly that hyperbolic growth, and over the last few years, it just continues on that 2x the rate of growth was every 3 to 4 months through 2018 from that turn.
So I want to come back to that, but before we do, what was maybe your biggest takeaway from GTC? What did you go home with thinking or feeling or learning that really stuck out?
That it's not just about the massive the LLMs and the hyperscalers. That AI is really going to be the next wave for AI, is moving it to the enterprise, where it's not clusters of thousands of GPUs, that will continue to be built out for the hyperscale, but it's for the enterprise customers who maybe are only using a couple of racks or a couple dozen racks and hundreds of GPUs or tens of GPUs, that it will, that's the next wave, and then it will move to the edge because there has to be edge processing. We've got to be able to do inferencing closer to where things are happening for live data. Things like autonomous driving is really an inference thing and has a different structure to it and a different workload than the training of these massive models in the data centers. And then storage, memory, networking, all of these are critical aspects to innovate in to enable AI to continue to grow.
Side note, just when you were talking about like what it takes for autonomous driving and everything, I saw a reel on Instagram last night that was dash cam or body cam footage from a police officer in Arizona. And he pulled over an autonomous driving car and didn't realize that that was what he was pulling over until he got up to the window. And you can imagine the shock that he had when there was no one in the car. But the car had driven the wrong way down a one-way. And it was because it was in a construction zone where they had done a traffic pattern change and all of this. And the car drove the wrong way. And so he pulls it over. And it was pretty interesting to watch the interaction. Basically, there was some form of audio AI agent that was like, hey, I see I've been pulled over. It talks to the police officer. And the police officer was like, hey, no, I need to talk to a person. Like, y'all just drove the wrong way down a one-way. This is a problem. And somebody eventually got on and was talking to him and everything. But it was fascinating to kind of see that play out. I'm sure it's probably not the first time something like that's happened, but it was just funny that I literally saw that last night before this episode. But
yeah, well, the Johnny Cat Total Recall, they weren't perfect either.
Yeah, exactly. So, one of the things why I said I'm really excited to have you on the podcast is we've talked a lot about AI in the last handful of episodes. Like, I make the joke, you kind of almost can't talk about technology anymore without talking about AI. They've pretty much become synonymous with each other, but we've talked a lot about the use cases, right? And so very specifically, we're talking to community financial institutions about how can you leverage AI within your institution, for example, for operational efficiency, or maybe how can you leverage AI for account holder operations or efficiency? And then, how is the industry as a whole adopting AI and those kinds of things? But that's not what we're going to talk about today. I mean, we'll touch on some of the different use cases and how they'll play into it. But what I think is super fascinating about kind of your area of expertise and where you guys are focused on and looking at is, like, what are the architecture and infrastructure implications of all of this AI technology that's coming to market? And like what we were just talking about, I mean, this kind of went from, yes, it was being worked on. Yes, AI has been here for a long time, but it went from being something that only a group of like super nerds were working on to, I mean, like my 70-year-old dad is using ChatGPT now, right? And just commonly in his day-to-day life. And so we've got to be able to supply the compute power for that and the energy requirements to power all of the machines that are doing that. And so guess what? As utilization of that technology is skyrocketing, so is everything that needs to come along with that to support that. And that's kind of your area of expertise. So would you maybe start by just giving us a little bit of background on this topic, I guess?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned in the intro, I've been in storage, right? So data storage and the transition to flash-based storage, and then at Scale Flux, looking into emerging memory technologies as well. So, we're coming at it from the data pipeline perspective of your data gets created, it needs to be stored, it needs to be moved through memory and moved to the processors. Well, AI has changed how that needs to happen because the capability of the GPUs to consume data has just far outpaced the ability of local storage and local memory to have the data there and feed it into the GPUs. So we talk in the industry about this as the memory wall, and that is the gap between the processor's ability to consume data and the data pipeline's ability to deliver data to the GPU. And that's I think in the industry, what it is every every 18 to 24 months, the processors have increased in data consumption capability by like 3x. And then the memory side, it's only increased by 1.4 to 1.8x. And you apply that multiplier over time, and the gap gets wider and wider and wider. So in order to keep those power hungry and dollar hungry GPUs fed, and so that you can get work done from them, we have to innovate in that data pipeline and how we provide data to the GPUs.
How, just out of curiosity, like how have you seen how much that's, so what was the term you used earlier? Sorry, I need to try and commit this one to memory. It took us 60 years to get to one, and then
Petaflop.
Like petaflop.
Yeah.
So how has, you talked about just the data point of how it took us 60 years to get to one, right? And then just in the last, from that point, it took 10 years to get to, what was the number again?
10 billion.
10 billion.
Yeah.
Right. So quantify that for me. Like, what does that mean? Is that like, going from 1 horsepower in a horse and buggy to like a Formula One car, or like, what does this just mean in the sense of like, what are the impacts of it?
It's going from a horse and buggy to a Mars lander, I think, in terms of power. As a Formula One car, they're maybe, I don't know, a couple thousand horsepower. And we're talking going from 1 to 10 billion. So it's hard to fathom that growth.
So what does that mean in terms of like what has to happen to the infrastructure and the pipes to support that kind of exponential growth? Is that, and again, I'm just trying to quantify it for a dummy like me, right? Like, what does that mean? We've got to go from having, one little factory to now we've got to have, 100 different data centers with, going from one little tiny pipe to, 500,000 ginormous pipe. Like, what does this actually mean?
Well, what it means is if we did not innovate outside of, or if we didn't innovate in the efficiencies around the processors, around the data storage density, around the network efficiencies or the network bandwidth, then there's no way we could sustain this, right? I mean, you couldn't go from a horse to 10 billion horses, right? You have to go from a horse to a rocket or something like that. So
that's helpful.
From a efficiency standpoint, the processors have grown tremendously in how efficient they are in terms of how many operations per second and how many operations per watt that they can deliver. So that's, a massive part of how we achieve that efficiency. Storage and memory, the same thing. I think when I got really into when Flash started years ago, it was serial ATA, SATA based, and SATA could go 550 megabytes per second, right? That was the throughput that you could get reading off of an SSD. And that was 10 to 12 years ago. I don't know, time is a blur. And now we're on PCIe Gen 5 with Gen 6 coming around the corner. And at Gen 5, we're taking 14 gigabytes per second. So that's 28x. I'm doing my math right. 28x the throughput just reading off of that same little 2.5-inch drive. So, a tremendous amount of improvement in efficiencies there, because we're doing that within the same power envelope too, right? So, network speeds have gone from gigabit per second to 400 gigabit per second. So, just massive increases there. And it's all of these
That was a
efficiencies compounding against each other that keep it from being that we need the power of the sun in order to to do what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay. That's where I was trying to kind of get to, because that was really, really helpful, kind of walking me through that way, JB. Thank you. That was what I needed to like wrap my head around, right? Was you can't go from one horse to 10 billion horses, right? And then expect 10 billion horses to somehow carry a payload to Mars.
Yeah.
Like the horses are just not equipped to that. And we don't have enough real estate to put 10 billion horses on it. So we have to completely shift and go to building rockets. Right. And that's kind of what we're talking about here too, right? In the way that we're using technology, it's not like just going from one horse to 10 billion horses. It's going from a horse to a rocket. And I want to say when you and I were talking, like the first time we met while we were kind of scheduling the podcast, you were talking about how, like, if we were to just go at the pace at which we're going with zero innovation, like we would run out of power to power all of these things in pretty short order, right?
Yeah.
So we have to have some form of innovation. I mean, we look at, we're already having things like rolling blackouts through California, and we're already talking about having to try and be more thoughtful about, sustainable energy and all of this. And at the same time, we're creating tools that require obscene amounts of energy. So those two are kind of button heads a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I missed part of that in the middle, but I think, it does come into the efficiencies overall and you have to look at not just the individual components, but how they interplay with each other, and start to look at system level optimizations, rack level optimizations, data center level optimizations in order to continue down the curve of efficiency. Like outside of the components themselves, which are, it's a struggle because they're definitely vastly more efficient in terms of work that they can do per watt, but the density of the power is also increasing. So, it used to be that a rack was, a few hundred watts, right? Or your processor, your enterprise class server processor was 100 to 200 watts. And now we're talking over a kilowatt for that processor in the GPUs. And to deal with that power density, we have to innovate in cooling, because historically we relied upon air, right? Those whiny high pitched fans in your data center pushing air as fast as they could across the fins to move heat away from the chips and then move them out through the rest of your HVAC system. And there's only so much air can do, right? So now there's liquid cooling, which is like the radiator it's really the radiator in your car, and it's moving, instead of just relying upon air, but having liquid that's contained in a radiator attached to the chips and then moving away, and then to full immersion cooling, which is even more efficient. That's where they're taking the vats of, I don't know, the liquid they put in there, but they just stick the servers right down into the racks of liquid and move the liquid across to get the heat away from the processors. And all of that is, I don't have the stats on the efficiency metrics off the top of my head, but the full immersion cooling is significantly more efficient in terms of how much energy you use to cool the chips than air, right? In data centers, there was the metric called PUE, or power usage effectiveness. And that was for every watt of compute or networking or storage power you used, how much extra did you have to use for cooling and other things and lighting, et cetera, in your infrastructure. And that used to be like 2.6 was kind of an awesome metric. And the hyperscalers had gotten that down to about 1.2. But then it was threatening to come back up, because you just couldn't continue to get efficiency improvements with air. And so these other cooling metrics or cooling technologies are helping continue to keep that PUE pretty close to 1. I mean, 1 would be the ultimate, right?
Yeah, again, this is why this fascinates me. So this is just not an area that I've done a lot of research or understanding in, but I remember seeing something about, I don't know, it's probably longer ago than I think it is in my head, but like Google bringing out of the ocean some of their like data centers that they put into capsules and sunk under the ocean, right? To
Right.
check up on them, and just like that was a huge moment when that happened. So these are just different techniques that we're trying to use to find ways to maximize our power consumption. So for, every bit of compute power, we're using less and less energy, right?
Right. That is the goal.
Well, so again, that's why this stuff is so fascinating. Like, same token, I was just trying to read up on oh my gosh, I shouldn't. It was Microsoft's new quantum computer. And I was just reading on less about the actual computer itself, but more just about the cooling system that they were having to put in place. And just for this quantum computer to run, Microsoft not only had to develop a quantum computer, but they had to develop the coldest environment we've ever measured in history. I'm like, that's crazy. Again, that's like, I mean, you're talking two totally different areas of expertise having to come together to create this one tool. And it's just around, it needs to be so darn cold to even function. Like, that's wild to me.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about, you mentioned the quantum computing, and I don't know too much on that, but like the quantum safe encryption needs to come along with that, right? Of how do we encrypt and protect data such that a quantum computer can't crack the encryption? And because as a storage guy, then I'm worried about how do I protect the data? How do I make sure that it's safe and nobody can crack into your secret data? But the quantum safe encryption, it seems like that's still a ways off because it takes too much energy and too much compute power to encrypt the data that it's just not practical to deploy it.
That's crazy. But again, like these are where the innovations are happening, right? And if we told people even 5 years ago some of the stuff that we have access to today, they'd think we were crazy.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yet here we are and we have it, right? I mean, probably even a large swath of probably tech savvy and tech forward people, if we had told them that like I could pull up ChatGPT on my cell phone at a bus stop and do some of the things I can do with it, even just 5 years ago, they would have thought I was crazy, right? And yet here we are, and you know, you don't even have to work in technology. You could be, in burger flipping at McDonald's, and you're leveraging ChatGPT to do complex computes. It's like, that's pretty cool. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens in 5 years. And so where do you think the focus on innovation will need to happen in the next 5 years for that kind of stuff to actually come to fruition?
So there's several aspects of the innovation that have to come into play. I mean, the software has to be there, right, to take advantage of or for these models to continue to evolve. But I'm kind of one step away from those applications and more on the how do we get the data to there, and that from what I see is it's innovation in the file systems and and the data orchestration layer. How do you give your GPUs access to all of the data that you have across all of your servers and for larger companies, across all of the geographically dispersed sites that you have. And then once you've got that data orchestration and massively parallel file system resolved, how do I get the storage and the networking fast enough? How do I get the memory fast enough? Because even, there's orders of magnitude more latency as you move from the cache that's within the processor itself to local DRAM to distributed DRAM to storage, right? These are orders of magnitude higher latency levels going from nanoseconds to microseconds to seconds depending how far away things are. And to deal with this growth in the compute capability, we've got to be able to grow the volume and the speed of the data, right? So we've got to be able to have more data faster with greater access to those GPUs in order to keep them from starving. You know, an analogy that I used was if you've got, you imagine you're a farmer and you've got this, your huge field that you're planting for crops. And you got a whole lake, right? You got a whole lake of water to keep them irrigated. So the fields are your processor, the lake is all your data, but if all you have is a tin can, you know, a little watering can, your field is going to go fallow, right? It's going to go, your crops are going to starve, they're going to die. So you need to innovate in your irrigation system or that data pipeline. How do I get data from storage and from memory into those GPUs and distributed there so they can stay watered?
I like that analogy. I want to kind of explore that with you because, you know, my simple brain is kind of trying to think through. There's so many different variables to what an end consumer of any technology sees, right? I mean, just let's use the simple example of, you know, I'm just sitting at a bus stop and I'm using ChatGPT for whatever, right? To me, that seems really simple. I just open up the app on my phone and I type stuff into the bar.
Yeah.
That's it. But like what's happening underneath of the surface is so many different things that are all working together, but are all on their own separate like innovation tracks, right? So using your analogy, right? And I'm sure there's like umpteen million variables that we're not even equating for in this analogy that only make it that much more complex. But let's just say it's just as simple as the field and the crops, the water to water the crops, and then, you know, the pipe to be able to get the water to and from the crops. Well, if you start with a perfectly stable system, right, and you have a field that's only so big that grows so many crops, and you have exactly the right amount of water that you need to be able to water those crops, and the correct irrigation system to bring the right amount of water to those crops at the right time, you're good. You have a great stable system. But let's say that's to feed your family of 5.
Right.
But then you say you want to be able to feed, you know, your neighborhood. Okay, well, I need more crops. So you could just plant more crops, but then you would have to, in theory, perfectly add more water, more pipe to add more water to those crops. Well, what if you could find ways to innovate in any one of those areas, right? So now we say, okay, well, I'm going to create maybe a higher density potato with more calories. So I need to grow less potatoes and to feed a larger number of people, right? Okay, well, that's one innovation that helped you. But what if, you know, all of a sudden that then required significantly more water than you have?
Yeah.
Well, now you've got to find an innovation in water because your innovation in the potatoes is useless without the more water. So you create more water, but now your pipe system doesn't meet that. Well, now you've got the ability to have the more efficient potato. You've got more water, but you've got no way to transport it between the two. So your innovation here in the end user experience hasn't actually changed because the whole stream hasn't actually caught up. And I think that's what you're telling us, right? Is like there's this constant battle of each of these groups is evolving and innovating at different speeds. And we're trying to have to like meet the lowest common denominator. So you could have this incredible computer that could do all of this stuff, but if you don't have the cooling for it, like, well, you're kind of crap out of luck. Like your computer's useless, right? So there's this like constant push and pull of innovation that's happening in each of those.
Yeah. I mean, that's in the computing world, it's a constant game of whack-a-mole as to what is the current bottleneck, right?
Yeah.
As soon as you solve one, another one pops up. So
This is probably an overgeneralization, but maybe not. But what would you say is like the current biggest bottleneck?
I think it is feeding the GPUs the data. It is the pipeline of and the efficiency of loading the data into the GPUs and getting it back out. So we talk, and NVIDIA, this is a public thing. NVIDIA's talked about, hey, the IO size that, or the data chunk size that we need to process on is very different from the IO chunks or the data chunk size that storage serves. Right? We need something much, much smaller. And when we ask storage for the smaller chunk, we actually get less total data in because we don't get more IOs. So, the bandwidth is the IO size times the number of IOs, right? Or mass times velocity, And so if you can't increase the velocity by decreasing the mass, then you just got less. And so it's how do we innovate in the access to data that is in storage to better match it and increase that payload of data that's reaching the GPU so that they can stay hydrated.
Again, using I like your farm analogy from earlier. This is really helping me because in any scenario, there's possibly multiple different ways to accomplish it, right? So if we're saying right now, we've got enough water and we've got big enough crops, we're just not able to get the water from the, lake to the crops. One method would be to get more pipes of water. Right. Another method would be get bigger pipes. Another method may be totally different, and it may be saying, reduce the size of a water droplet, but maintain the hydration benefit that it has at the end for the crop. So maybe I needed, or at the other end, right? Like reduce the amount of water the crop even needs. Right. So maybe the potato used to need a gallon of water to grow, but if we can make it so that it only needs a half a gallon, then we only need to transport a half a gallon. Or if conversely, like 1 gallon of water creates the right amount of hydration for the potato to grow, what if we can, genetically modify the water to be a half a gallon is as good as a gallon to the same potato, even with no innovation in the potato? Like right there, there's like 4 different ways we could solve the problem. So I'm assuming that what you're seeing in your industry is there's probably people picking each of those different paths and trying to innovate in each of those, right?
Yeah. So, like we look at, I'll start with memory, which is the fastest thing and the closest to the processor, but it's also the smallest in capacity. And, I mentioned earlier the cache that's in the processor itself. That's the fastest, but also the smallest and the most expensive per gigabyte or megabyte of capacity. So recently, you've seen what's called HBM or high bandwidth memory hit the stage. And I think in Micron's earnings, they just said that this last year was the first year was over $1 billion in revenue just on this new technology, HBM. And that gives a higher capacity of faster local memory that sits outside the processor. And then, so that helps with solving this memory wall or data pipeline problem, but it's not a complete, solution because it's still very expensive and still not enough capacity. So there's this other technology called CXL or Compute Express Link is the full name. You can look them up, computeexpresslink.org, I think. And that is allowing you to attach memory in a different manner. So instead of historically, you have to attach DRAM, like on your laptop, you're probably familiar with DRAM, connects directly to the chip, the processor, because the processor has a certain number of lanes that it can connect out to the memory. But the volume and speed is going to be limited by those lanes. But it also has these other lanes that are used to connect out to storage and networking and other components called PCI. So CXL allows you to connect memory off of the PCIe or PCI Express lanes. And that gives you a whole different way in which you can attach memory. And so now you can, exponentially increase the volume of that super fast memory that you can attach. And then even on the storage side, we're looking at how do we improve the payload of data that comes off of the drives? Can you more intelligently select the data that gets moved? Or can we align better with the size of IO chunk that the processors need? So these are innovations at all of these different stages, and dozens of different players, or probably hundreds of players in the industry working on these different technologies.
You know what I keep thinking about in the back of my head, JB, is if, okay, for me, this is super fascinating because like some of the stuff that you're talking about, yeah, if you're, somebody who maybe works in technology for a community financial institution, maybe a lot of these terms make sense to you. Very few of them make sense to me. These are not my daily vernacular, right? No, I love it. I love it. That's what, again, like this is how we learn is I want to get outside of the comfort zone of the acronyms I use on a daily basis and understand like what is happening outside of our space. But what I keep thinking back to is if I'm sitting there as somebody who works for a community financial institution, I'm wondering like, what does this all mean for me? If I boil it down super crazy simple, and JB, I want you to keep me honest here. Like what this means is just we're talking about all of the millions of different factors that go into your ability to leverage the latest and greatest of technology for your specific use cases. Mm-hmm. And this has everything to do with your access and cost to these things, right? So, perfect case in point, like you could have absolutely deployed an AI strategy for a specific use case at your financial institution 10 plus years ago, right? But it was probably astronomically expensive and required some really serious in-house, technical expertise and aptitude to be able to pull it off. But today, this stuff has been simplified down so much, and because of the innovations that are happening in efficiency, it's become cheap enough that you can use a lot more of this type of stuff. So I just wanted to kind of draw that parallel for you if you're sitting here listening to this episode. Like what JB is talking about is all the behind the scenes stuff that's happening, so that I can just sit at a bus stop and pull out my phone and use ChatGPT. Like it seems so simple.
Yeah, and on your bus stop, just using the GPT, it's now you're using GPT instead of Google in a lot of cases, right? And behind the scenes, the infrastructure and the processing and the way that they're managing the data and working to give you your response to your quick GPT query versus the Google query takes 10 times as much power. So, when that's
you say
another
power, are you meaning like literal electricity?
Yeah. Kilowatt hours or watt hours of energy. Yes.
Okay. I'm glad you said that, because this is one of the things that keeps coming up in my head, that this is one of the things that absolutely terrifies me, if I'm being totally honest. I'm just going to lay my cards out on the table, right? Like, I think we're smart enough at this point to know, at least I hope, we have a finite number of resources on this planet. And we're kind of going through some of them at some pretty rapid paces. And what's interesting is that, we're moving so much to electric, everything from, cars to you name it. And so across the board, like our energy consumption of electricity is skyrocketing. And if you're talking about, just the energy needed to run ChatGPT is 10x Google. Well, that wasn't a big deal when like 5 people were using ChatGPT. But all of a sudden, when the entire planet starts realizing, oh, this thing's way better than Google, this is great, I'm going to move to ChatGPT. Well, we just 10x'd our expectation for energy consumption. How are we meeting that? Like, if we're already talking about having issues with electricity on the power grid, now, we're again going down the conversation of like what becomes the weakest link. And I'm thinking in my head, dude, this could be as simple as literally just like the freaking power grid just can't handle this crap. Who cares about like, Google's ability to manage its own electricity, but like, can the friggin' power grid handle it? And all of a sudden, like if everybody is laying in bed at night in town and decides they want to jump on ChatGPT, Like all of a sudden we nuke our own little grid and we go off grid and send ourselves back to the Stone Age by trying to like, you know, live in 2050 using ChatGPT. I don't like, these are the kinds of things that get my head going. I'm like, I don't understand the complexities behind the requirements for all of this, but even my simple brain starts to wonder, what is this going to mean for us long term?
Well, it's going to mean we have to innovate. Sorry to go back to that, but we have through the decades, society and the engineering teams have been great at improving efficiencies, right? I mean, you look at how many light bulbs are used today versus 50 years ago, but the power consumption is so much more efficient that even as we electrified the world and things, we only saw over the past few decades, I forget my specific stats when that started, but there was only kind of a 1 to 2% per year growth in total power consumption. And that's with all this electrification and using more light bulbs, using more electric vehicles, et cetera. Data centers are kind of the break in that. They've been growing at 12 to 16% per year total growth in total consumption globally. So that's 8x the rate of everything else. And just the stat was, I think, from 2022 to 2024, we added the equivalent of France to the global power grid just for data centers. So data centers on their own are now, if you were to separate them as a country, they are the 5th largest country in the world for consumption of power, of electricity.
That's
behind China, US, India, and Japan, I think. So the power data centers, if they were their own country, would be 5th. And if we didn't have a lot of the innovation in like processors being able to do 100 times the amount of work per watt as they did 10 years ago, and the efficiencies in cooling, et cetera, then that would be skyrocketing beyond there. So, the pressure is on to continue the innovation in that power efficiency and compute efficiency to deal with being able to grow out that or being able to meet that increasing demand for consumption of compute capability. But yeah, we can't rely upon one energy source to provide the electricity. We've got to, fossil fuels are certainly a significant contributor, but we've got to use renewables. We got to use geothermal. We got to use all kinds of innovation in how we generate that power.
I'm glad you kind of used that example. That helped me too, of light bulbs and how we have more light bulbs than ever, but very little additional power consumption just because they've gotten more efficient. And yeah, I remember even when I was a kid, like my dad yelling at me for like, turn the light off if you leave the room. Like, I'm not paying for that. Right. And now I have so many stinking lights in this house and they're always on and I don't even pay attention to it. And I bet you if we left for a month versus we're home for a month, my electric bill would change by like $5, Yeah. I mean, just the efficiency of these modern, super efficient LED bulbs and stuff, like you don't even notice. So there is that's happening. But so I'm curious if you've like, is there any conversation around until we get better at energy optimization? Are there other talks about how we handle this? I mean, I guess very bluntly, I'm going to ask, like, have you heard, have we talked about throttling any of this stuff and say, hey, look, if we turn the world loose on using AI for absolutely everything at the pace at which it's going, like we cannot innovate power consumption fast enough. We cannot create enough energy fast enough. And like, we'll put ourselves in a dire position if we don't throttle this. Like, is that even a thing? Is that being talked about?
I haven't heard of that as a direct initiative. However, in looking at the power supply and all this, I have seen plenty of instances where they've said, hey, like Northern Virginia, for example, which is a big data center alley, that the guys that want to build data centers are, they've got the money, they've got the land, they can build the infrastructure, but the power supply isn't there. And so the data center build outs are getting delayed because the electric grid can't be built out fast enough to supply the energy for these new data centers. And then if you look at like the Project Stargate initiative that the US has, some of those are now, it's a co-development, right? You're building out all of this data center floor space, but you're also building a power generation plant co-located or nearby located. You see Microsoft bringing up one of the reactors, I think, on 3 Mile Island to support their data center grow out and build out. And I've seen a lot of buzz around small nuclear reactors, or SMR, small modular reactors, SMRs, for where like one nuclear reactor per data center. And these aren't the nuclear reactors that I grew up with. They're vastly more efficient, and they can even use waste from other older nuclear plants. I mean, the innovation in the electrical generation is amazing, and just an entirely different industry. So it takes all of these different industries and different technologies coming together to help satisfy this growing demand.
Yeah, I mean that is what's crazy is like just even in this, hour that you and I have been chatting, like how many different industries we've talked about need to have innovation happen for innovation in AI to happen. Right? Like there's so many different things that go into it. And I think that's what, as you were talking about just like power consumption and everything and talking about the different ways that they're thinking about it, I think that's also what creates some of these, the public perceives are massive leaps in a technology. So again, keep me honest here, but like, let's say tomorrow somebody comes out of nowhere, at least to us, right? And says, hey, we have created the Tony Stark Iron Man reactor. We have unlimited energy, easily created, very little resources that are required. All of a sudden, we increase our ability to deliver power by, I don't know, it's just something ridiculous, like 500 billion%, right? You would all of a sudden, yes, you'd see that crazy innovation in energy consumption or energy production, right? You'd see it in that, sector, but you'd also see it in AI and data centers, right? Because all of those data centers that you were just talking about that could not get built, all of a sudden can get built now because they've got the power. So you would see this massive innovation happen in data centers because there was a massive innovation that happened in a totally separate vertical.
Yeah, I mean they feed off each other, and like already, you mentioned the GTC last week. So Jensen Huang talks about using their chips, the GPUs and AI to help design the next generation of processors and the next generation of AI. So it's AI is helping innovate in AI, but also in a different way, AI is being used to improve the efficiency of the power grid, improve the efficiency of the power generation. So these are, everything feeds off of each other.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I don't know. I'm sure you've seen there was a picture going around the internet recently of some rocket scientists had built an AI model to actually go out and redesign a more efficient rocket booster.
Okay.
And this thing is wild looking. Like, it's super trippy. It looks like almost a negative space painting as opposed to like a more traditional painting. It's super weird looking, but they're showing all the stats of just how like crazy more efficient this thing is than the rocket booster they based the design off of. They basically, built the model for this AI, taught it, gave it all the data, all the different, studies they've done on their rocket boosters in the past. And then they said, take this one and make it more efficient. Yeah. And then they said, actually, just throw everything away that we've done before and just build the most efficient one possible. And what it turned out, like, kind of resembles a rocket booster, but kind of doesn't. And, it's exponentially more efficient. It's cheaper to produce. So, it's like feeding that cycle is pretty fascinating to watch.
Yeah, yeah, because it can iterate, millions of times faster than we can iterate in our brains.
Yeah. What are some of the things that kind of concern you about the next set of innovations that happen and where the next set of bottlenecks could come? So let's say you guys solve the bottleneck that's currently kind of balls in your court, right? Like that gets solved. Where do you think it shifts next, and what kind of concerns you about that next stage?
Networking will certainly continue to be one of the moles that pops up in whack-a-mole in the bottlenecks. I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but the processors, man, they're just growing in their capability. I do worry about just that power density becoming a bottleneck. There's the innovation with the direct to chip liquid cooling and the immersion cooling, but still going from one person in the elevator to 10 people in the elevator, and how much heat it gets generated there over as those processors increase their power density. I that is something that is going to be a challenge, right? As to how can you continue to cool that increasing power density? And maybe it's this thing that you talked about for the quantum computing cooling with Microsoft of just a totally different means to get there.
I think it's interesting that that's what you brought up, because again, like this is not my area of expertise, but that's where my head was going too. Is like the one that kind of concerns me behind just the power consumption is the cooling of all of this stuff. And again, going back to, you were saying, we started with fans. Well, fans are only going to get efficient to a certain point, and you're going to max that out probably pretty quickly. At the same time, those fans take electricity, so you got to generate electricity to move the fans, etc. So there's that thing. And then we're talking about, liquid cooling and stuff like that. Well, we've got to get this liquid. So what is it? And sure, if it's water, we've got quite a bit of that, but I would venture to guess it's probably not just straight water, right? So again, we're using more resources. Even just thinking about like the whole Google syncing that thing. I don't know. Like, I'm a technologist. I love the innovation. I like capitalism. I think it brings about some pretty cool stuff. But at the same time, like, I don't know, man. I don't know how I feel about syncing a bunch of stuff on our beautiful ocean floor. And like, do we want to get to the point where it's like my grandkids like don't even really want to go swimming in the ocean anymore because it's just a bunch of Google storage containers for data centers right off the coast, and the coast isn't pretty anymore? Like, I don't know. It's just, these are the things that you think about, that it's like, again, maybe is this going to be, I don't know if I want to use the word catastrophic, but like catastrophic in your and my lifetime? Probably not. In my kids, maybe. In my grandkids, really, maybe. Like, I don't know. You start to get to the point where it's like you see some of these old, sci-fi movies, and it's like everything has been industrialized. There's no nature. Like, I don't know. Do we really want that for our planet? I don't think so. So I don't know. It's this crazy like give and take. But at the same time, I really love using ChatGPT. So
yeah, I mean that there's a lot of work on sustainability and how do we make like us a more circular environment with the heat generation. And I saw something recently where, and I forget which vendor was doing it, but they were taking some of the heat that was generated from the processors and the compute infrastructure, and then leveraging that for heating other buildings, right? So rather than it just becoming waste heat that we need to get out into the environment, it's like, hey, well, we need heat elsewhere, so let's reuse this. So, I think we can. It's all a matter of time, right? But we can certainly start to make things more recyclable and more of a circular use of all of the aspects that go into supporting the data center infrastructure, from the components to the power.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is fascinating.
Yeah.
I I should probably do a little bit more research on it before talking about it too much. But because too, it was just, I'm pretty sure it was like an ad on Instagram. But I remember seeing this. I want to say it's on like Kickstarter or something right now. And it's a little portable heater, like an office space heater, but it's a Bitcoin mining machine. And they're like, hey, we're gonna use this thing to mine Bitcoin, but at the same time, the heat that's generated we'll use as a space heater. And so they're like, hey, we want to mine more Bitcoin, but also you need to heat your office. Let's do the same, or let's do both at the same time. I'm like, that's pretty cool. Simple little solutions. It's not like saving, or, solving world hunger, but like, hey, step at a time.
Yeah. Rather than just wasting the heat.
Yeah. I was like, that's pretty cool. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll start to see more stuff like that. And again, all it takes is, one huge breakthrough in one area. And like you were saying, it totally shifts which mole we've got to whack.
Yeah.
Well, JB, this has been absolutely fascinating, man. Thank you so much for coming and like talking to me about stuff that, I don't know. It's when, just to maybe peel back the layers of transparency, it was JB's PR team that reached out and was like, hey, we have a guest for your podcast. And I got like the bio and what they were pitching. And I was like, I don't think this makes any sense for me. And I was like, no, wait, actually, this is really fascinating because like I was saying, I mean, if you're sitting there as, somebody who's, taking up the charge, leading the next generation of innovation for a community financial institution, a lot of that's centered around tech. And it's really fascinating to understand like what's happening below the tip of the iceberg in tech to be able to give us the ability to have this type of tool set at our disposal, unlike what we've ever had before. And it's all of these different advancements that are happening across our, farm field to be able to help us do the things that we're doing in our industry. And again, I know it sounds kind of silly, but it's like you think about the place of a community financial institution is hopefully to improve, the financial health, well-being, and future of their account holders and the communities that they serve. And today, a lot of that's done through technology. And so all of this innovation that's happening in making data centers more efficient, as crazy as it sounds, but that is also having an impact on our ability to provide those really amazing services to our communities and our people. So like all of this stuff goes hand in hand. And it was really fascinating to kind of talk through with you just what's happening that's impacting our industry and how it's kind of taking place in yours. So thank you.
And a lot of these, a lot of things we talk about, the environmental impacts, they're a little more abstract than your primary listeners might be worried about on a daily basis. But all of these innovations also contribute to making all of their IT infrastructure more cost efficient, such that they can get more done, not just per watt. Like I think about that efficiency, but they can get more done per dollar that they spend on their IT infrastructure as well through the innovations that are being delivered.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? I mean, all of this again is driving down. I mean, think about how much it used to cost you to potentially run. Maybe you were a credit union that ran your core and maybe digital banking in-house, and like what that cost you holistically versus now running it in shared compute resources in a cloud environment. And maybe it's not even just about dollar for dollar, it's cheaper. But not only is it maybe cheaper, but it's exponentially more efficient. You're getting so much more processing power. More transactions are flowing through that. You're able to offer more services to your members, right? All of that is because of these innovations that are happening here. So, yeah, good point. Well, JB, before I turn you loose on your day, I got two final questions for you, sir. So First off, where do you go to get information about what's happening in the industry, and how do you stay informed on which mole is popping up that you guys got to whack?
Well, I recently found one newsletter, and they do a pretty good job of hitting some different topics and kind of putting them in historical perspective. It is more AI focused, and that's AI supremacy. And
Okay.
then
I like it.
for the industry that, I am very focused on the data storage and the memory. So storage newsletter, storage review are two of the kind of quintessential areas or sources that we go to find out what's new and interesting, what's going on with different vendors, what's going on with different technologies. And then at the data center level, as I've been doing some of this more global type of research, Uptime Institute is a great source for what's going on with data centers, and they often have surveys and results so you can see how you're doing against your peers or what other people are worried about with their data center infrastructure.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm gonna have to check a few of those out for sure. And then last but not least, if people want to connect with you or if they want to learn more about Scale Flux and what you guys are doing, how can they do that?
Sure. I LinkedIn's pretty easy. I'm jb.baker or jbbaker on LinkedIn, and you can find me via Scale Flux. Scale Flux, we've got, our website, scaleflux.com. LinkedIn, we're very active on LinkedIn as well. And we even have a YouTube channel. So you can search Scale Flux on YouTube and see our channel there. And we have mostly educational videos. We have one recently that's pretty fun. So you might want to take a look at the fun video too.
Well, now I'm intrigued. Oh, it's awesome. Thank you, sir. Well, again, I really appreciate this. This has been a kind of a fun detour from maybe the normal conversations that I would have on the podcast, but it was really informative about, again, just how innovation, both in and out of our direct industry, directly impacts the innovation that happens in our industry. So thanks for taking time to come and be a guest, JB. I appreciate it.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity here, Josh.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Banking Podcast powered by Typho. Find more episodes on digitalbankingpodcast.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.